You've been around for 20, 30, 40 years. You begin to develop ingrained beliefs about what works and what doesn't work.
Now that it's so obvious that you need to have those more personal communication points or accessibility with the financial brands, what is the main obstacle that is stopping them from adopting these technologies and being much more active and much more invested into it?
I think there's not really barriers to stopping it. There's really, I think, internal issues that they have from an organizational perspective, especially the larger banks. For you in Canada, you're mostly dominated by five very large financial institutions who are very complex from an organizational perspective in terms of organizational structure and design. Here in the U.S., we've got thousands of financial institutions, much fewer that are of huge size. But really, once you get to about $50 billion in assets and above here in the US, you're still getting to be kind of a large company. And part of the problems and challenges they have, Vlad, is really an organizational issue. And I think there's a few things. First of all, from an organizational perspective, think about how things like budgeting gets done. You get a budget that gets set at some point in time, and then next year you fight to get a higher budget for your department or division. And because the org structures in a lot of banks are channel driven, there are groups that manage the online channels, groups that manage the branches, a group that manages the contact center, and so forth. Each fights for their budget. And yeah, they might not get the increase that they wanted, or they may have to take a little bit of a decrease. Those are not that impactful year over year. Digital channels certainly seeing more investment, but we're not seeing a lot of the money coming out of the branches per se or out of the contact centers. So they're not actively managing and forcing the shift from one channel to another. Another big barrier, I think, has nothing to do even with the organizational structure or even with technology itself, but just the human aspect to this. Who runs these large banks? Well, they tend to be people of at least a certain age. You don't see a lot of 23 and 24-year-olds running large banks, and that's just the way it goes and the way it should go. You need some experience in a business before you can manage a large organization. So most of the people at the top of large banks have been there 20, 30, even 40 years. You've been around for 20, 30, 40 years. You begin to develop ingrained beliefs about what works and what doesn't work. And no amount of consulting hype, no amount of consumer studies and surveys is going to get you to change your opinion in the short term. You need a period of time of seeing, hey, this is not working anymore. And I think we're at the point where they're getting that now. So it's taken 7, 8 years of this fintech emergence. And at first it was like, yeah, they're small. This is not really, going to impact us too. Yeah, it's still on the fringes, and then it becomes kind of more mainstream, and then they really start to feel the pressure. So we're only really at the beginning of that shift in the mental approach to this. And I think we're also at the precipice from a generational shift. The baby boomers who have been in charge for the past 10 years, are now, a minimum of 56, 57 years old, going up to 75, and they're pretty much out, retired already. So we're at the precipice of kind of shifting the power to the Gen Xers and the older millennials who are now, believe it or not, 40 years old. So that's helping to kind of knock down the barriers. And this is not stuff that anybody couldn't predict, Vlad. I started my consulting career back in the mid 80s. I remember having a PC my first job out of school was in a hospital. I didn't even mention that, and I remember coming into the hospital and there was a approval for a IBM System 5520 word processing system. No, I think that's what it was. I could be making that up, I remember going to the executive director of the hospital saying, why are we spending all this money on a bunch of word processing systems for the administrative assistants when we can spend that money and get 15 PCs that we could be doing a whole lot more with? And this guy said, okay, only one thing is you're going to be in charge of making sure that stuff works. And so, what I learned back then was you got a lot of people back then who didn't want to put their hands on a PC. They're like, I'm not a secretary. I don't type. That is such a foreign concept today. Everybody uses a keyboard. Everybody uses a PC, a laptop, or something like that. And so that was a very similar, mental shift back then. And it was at the point where the pre-baby boomers were in charge, and when the baby boomers were starting to take over. And that's where we are today. The mental shift is happening, and the generational shift is happening. So we're going to see those barriers to change really come down over the course of this decade.